Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the name Medusa, what comes to mind?
For most people, I think it's that instant kind of terrifying image.
Totally. A
Right.
face framed by writhing snakes instead of hair.
In those eyes,
Hmm.
the ones that can turn you to stone. She's probably one of the most recognized figures from Greek mythology, and maybe one of the most feared.
That image is absolutely indelible, isn't it? But who was she, really? I mean, beyond just the monster.
Yeah, where did that striking, terrifying image actually come from? And why does it still have such, well, such power and fascination for us thousands of years later?
That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at Medusa not just as, a character in old stories, but as this really potent symbol.
One that's traveled through time, shedding old meanings and picking up entirely new ones as different people in different eras have looked her in the eye, so to speak.
And we've got a fascinating stack of sources to help us figure this out. We've looked into the Wikipedia entry on Medusa, some excerpts from a piece called Medusa, From Ancient Terror to Modern Icon, and another article, The Curse of Medusa, from Greek mythology.
Yeah, quite a bit to work with.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace her story. From her ancient origins through these big shifts in how she was portrayed, right up to her, well, surprising resurgence as a really complex modern symbol.
And we want to pull out the key insights about how she evolved and what that enduring, sometimes contradictory symbolism is all about.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning, the ancient core of the myth. Who are the Gorgons?
Well, the sources introduce Medusa as one of three Gorgon sisters. There's Medusa, Steno, and Euryale, pretty fearsome figures in the old text.
And their parents. Does everyone agree on that?
Not entirely, which is pretty typical for mythology.
Yeah.
Hesiod and Apollodorus say their parents were the sea god Phorcys and his sister Ceto. But then Hyginus gives a slightly different take, mentioning Gorgon and Ceto. But there's always this link back to these, primordial sea deities.
Got it. And there's one really crucial detail about Medusa specifically, Rhea.
Absolutely key.
Yeah.
Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, they were immortal. But Medusa, she was mortal.
Which is huge because it means she could be killed. That's central to her most famous story.
Exactly. And she, along with her sisters, is described with this classic, terrifying appearance. Living snakes for hair, sometimes shown with big faces, maybe fangs or tusks. And of course, that legendary gaze, so hideous, it turned anyone who looked at her straight into stone.
But was she always shown that way right from the start? I thought some sources mentioned variations.
That's where it gets really interesting when you dig in. While that monstrous image is definitely dominant, especially early on when the goal was pure terror.
Yeah.
There's a story from the Roman poet Ovid that gives a completely different origin for her looks.
Ovid's version, that's the one with the really tragic backstory, isn't it?
Exactly. According to Ovid, Medusa wasn't born a monster at all.
Yeah.
She was originally a beautiful young woman, famous for her amazing hair.
And the tragedy kicks off after Neptune, that's the Roman Poseidon, mates with her, and crucially, where this happens.
Right, in the temple of Minerva, the Roman Athena.
And shockingly, Minerva punishes Medusa for this, not Neptune.
Yeah, it's Minerva who transforms Medusa's beautiful hair into snakes and curses her with the petrifying gaze. It's a really powerful, disturbing story. Brings in themes of beauty, corrupted violation, and, the injustice of the punishment falling on the victim.
And it's interesting, one source points out that even before Ovid wrote that down, some earlier Greek art had started showing her differently sometimes.
Right, not always just the monster.
Yeah.
Sometimes depicted as maybe an attractive young woman, perhaps even asleep, right before Perseus shows up.
So the idea that she wasn't just a monster might have been floating around even earlier, kind of setting the stage for later interpretations.
It seems like it. But in the most famous myth cycle, she is still presented as the monster, the one the hero Perseus has to slay.
And this quest, this is the big climax for her in those ancient stories. King Polydectes sends Perseus off to get her head.
Believing it's an impossible mission, basically. He wants Perseus out of the way so he can marry Perseus's mother.
But Perseus gets help, like heroes often do. Divine help.
A lot of help. Athena gives him that polished, mirrored shield. Hermes provides winged sandals. Hephaestus a special sword. And Hades lends his helm of invisibility. Quite the toolkit.
And that mirrored shield is the key, right? He can't look directly at her.
Exactly. Turn to stone. So he uses the reflection in the shield to see her indirectly guide his sword.
And because she's mortal.
He manages to behead her, yeah.
And something pretty wild happens right after her head is cut off, doesn't it? Stemming from that detail about Poseidon?
Yes. Because she was pregnant by Poseidon at the time, two figures spring from her dying body. The famous winged horse and Chrysaor, who's usually described as a giant. So even in death, she's this source of powerful mythical beings.
And her severed head becomes this incredibly potent weapon for Perseus.
Totally. He carries it around and uses its petrifying power. Famously turns the Titan Atlas, who holds up the sky, into stone.
Wow.
And later uses it on King Polydectes himself and his court, turning them all to stone when they doubt he actually did it.
And eventually he gives the head to Athena.
Right. Who places it on her shield, the Aegis. Which brings us to something really significant about her ancient legacy, the Gorgonian.
The Gorgonian. Tell us about that.
It's simply the image of Medusa's head. And it became super common in classical antiquity as like an evil-averting device, an apotropaic symbol.
So people put it on things for protection.
Exactly. On shields, obviously, but also amulets, buildings, even coins. It was meant to ward off evil, scare enemies, protect the wearer or the place.
That's fascinating. The thing that was so deadly is also used as a guardian.
That duality is really striking. And the sources mention other myths linking her spilled blood to transformations too, creating corals in the Red Sea, venomous snakes in the Sahara, even this weird creature called the amphisbaena.
It just shows how deeply embedded she was in their whole way of thinking about the world, doesn't it? Her very remains had power.
Absolutely. And even where she lived was debated near Sistine, maybe Libya. Herodotus linked her to Berber religion. Some sources even suggest she was the original Gorgon, and the other two sisters were added later. It just underlines that myths weren't fixed, even back then.
What's so striking is that, yeah, even in the ancient world, there wasn't just one version of her. There were variations, hints of tragedy mixed in with the monster.
Which perfectly sets us up for how her meaning starts to shift pretty dramatically as history moves forward. Because the way we see figures like Medusa, well, it changes with the times.
Definitely. So fast forward past antiquity, what happens in the medieval period?
Well, often she gets kind of simplified and demonized. Her monstrous features fit neatly into Christian ideas about sin, evil, temptation. She becomes more purely destructive and vile in those interpretations.
Okay. But then the Renaissance happens.
Right. Renewed interest in classical myths. Artists revisit her story. Think of like Caravaggio's painting of her severed head.
Oh yeah, that's intense.
It's incredibly graphic, raw horror. But there's maybe an emotional depth there, hinting at the anguish under the monstrosity, even while focusing on that gruesome moment.
But the really big transformation where her meaning takes a radical turn, that happens later, right? Like 19th, 20th centuries.
That's when things get really interesting, yeah. And it seems heavily influenced by Ovid's tragic origin story, the beautiful maiden, the violation, the unjust punishment gaining more attention and sympathy.
Right. The idea that she wasn't born a monster, she was made one, that starts to hit differently.
Exactly. And she begins to be seen less as purely a monster and more, much more, as a tragic victim, a victim of divine cruelty, a violation of, frankly, patriarchal violence. Her fate starts looking like a huge injustice.
Being punished for something done to her.
Precisely. And this shift really opens the door for powerful feminist readings of her story.
Oh, so.
Well, Medusa's famous rage, which was originally just part of her monstrous nature, gets recontextualized. It's seen not just as monstrousness, but as maybe righteous fury.
Anger against those who wronged her.
Exactly. Against male figures of authority, maybe even against Athena, who punished her instead of protecting her.
And her gaze. The petrifying stare.
That gets reinterpreted too. Instead of just being a curse or a tool of random destruction, it's seen potentially as self-defense.
A weapon against oppressors.
Yeah, or a way to stop a hostile world or those who would harm her again. It becomes a symbol of power, albeit terrifying when wielded by the victim.
This sounds like it connects to that idea of the monstrous feminine.
It really does. Medusa comes to embody suppressed female rage. She challenges norms about beauty, about power, about who gets to be angry. She becomes this figure onto whom fears of powerful women are projected, but also for some, a figure of identification with that power and rage.
Even the snakes get a new symbolic meaning.
They can, yeah. Instead of just horror or evil, they might be reinterpreted as symbols of wisdom or transformation, or even primal female energy, maybe linked back to ancient earth goddesses.
And the sources give concrete examples of this feminist reclaiming, right?
Oh, yeah. A journal called Women, A Journal of Liberation used her image as a symbol of female rage and power. Emily Irwin Culpeper called her female fury personified.
And there's that famous essay by Helene Sixis.
The Laugh of the Medusa.
Right.
Sixis argues that men projected their fear of female desire and power onto Medusa, making her a monster. She says, basically, if you actually look at her, she's not deadly, she's beautiful, and she's laughing. It's a call for women to reclaim their own stories, their bodies, their voices.
And this continues today.
Definitely. Judy Tockett's #Medusa2 artworks directly link Medusa's trauma and transformation to the modern movement addressing sexual assault and victim blaming.
And politically, too. I remember reading something about that.
Yeah, one source notes how her story, especially the victim blaming and the female agency challenging male authority, led to her image being invoked in political commentary, like being called the original nasty woman around the 2016 U.S. election.
It's amazing how an ancient myth keeps finding relevance in modern debates about power and gender.
It really is. It acts like a lens. But it's important to remember, feminist interpretations aren't the only way she's been understood later on.
Right. The sources mention other perspectives, psychoanalysis.
Yeah, Freud had his famous interpretation linking the terror of Medusa to castration anxiety, seeing the snakes as sort of terrifying phallic symbols.
Okay.
And another psychoanalyst, Beth Selig, interpreted her curse through the lens of rape, trauma, and Athena's own issues, using ideas like triangulation between Poseidon, Medusa, and Athena.
Then there were historical takes.
Like Joseph Campbell suggesting the myth reflects a kind of sociological trauma. Maybe Hellenic invaders clashing with older goddess cults that used Gorgon masks. And Jane Ellen Harrison argued Medusa was the original figure, with the others added later.
And even philosophy gets in on it.
Jack London apparently used Medusa truth to represent a kind of harsh, maybe meaningless reality that people avoid by clinging to comforting illusions or beliefs, what he called Maya lie.
Wow. It's just incredible how one figure can hold so many different, sometimes opposing meanings. Monster, victim, icon of rage, philosophical symbol.
It really shows the depth and maybe the necessary ambiguity of myth, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And perhaps that adaptability is why she has this immortal echo in art, culture, even science.
Her presence in art history is undeniable. You see her image constantly revisited.
From ancient Greek pottery and Roman mosaics all the way through the Renaissance and Baroque Leonardo, Cellini, Caravaggio, Rubens, Bernini, they all tackled her image or story.
And it doesn't stop there. Later artists, too, like Canova, Backlund, Dali, Rodin.
And the sources even mention contemporary stuff, like Luciano Garbati's sculpture that flips the script entirely, showing Medusa holding Perseus' severed head. A total reversal of power.
Talk about challenging the original myth. And beyond fine art, her head still pops up as a protective symbol.
Yeah, like the ancient gorgonion. It's on the flag of Sicily, a coat of arms in the Czech Republic, French military belts, still used to ward off danger or signify strength.
And popular culture, obviously. She's everywhere.
Oh, completely. Films like Clash of the Titans, Percy Jackson, TV shows, books, video games, music too, UB40, Annie Lennox, Anthrax have all referenced her.
And the Versace logo, probably the most famous modern use.
Right. Chosen, the source says, because she represents beauty, art, and philosophy. Again, that complex mix of meanings far beyond just monster.
It's also wild to see her name used in science.
Isn't it? Loads of species and genera named after her. Sure, some snakes, that makes sense, but also jellyfish, you can see the tentacle connection.
Like snake hair.
Exactly. But also crustaceans, an extinct dinosaur, mollusks. It just speaks to how powerful and evocative her name and image are, that scientists see echoes of her in the natural world.
And the fact that she's mentioned by so many major ancient writers, Hesiod, Ovid, Homer, Virgil, Aeschylus, it just hammers home how central she was from early on.
Absolutely. Foundational stuff.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from Medusa, the ancient terror, the mortal Gorgon slain by Perseus,
to a figure reinterpreted over centuries. Demonic force, then tragic victim, and now often this powerful icon of female rage, resilience, a symbol for injustices faced by women.
She's the monster, the cursed beauty, the mother of mythical creatures, the protective emblem, the focus of psychoanalysis and philosophy, the symbol of defiance. Her story is anything but static.
It's a perfect example of how myths are alive. You know, they adapt, they get reread through the lens of changing values, and they keep resonating because they tap into these deep, timeless human things: fear, beauty, injustice, power, transformation.
Her petrifying gaze, once just a straightforward horror element, has become this complex lens. We use it to look at our own society's views on gender, on power, on victimhood, on who gets to tell the story.
She really challenges you to look past the surface, past just the monstrous image, and see all those layers underneath.
So here's something to think about. Why do certain myths, like Medusa's, lend themselves so easily to such wildly different, even contradictory interpretations over time?
Yeah, what does that tell us? Not just about her, but about myth itself, and maybe about our ongoing human need to constantly find new meaning and maybe reflections of ourselves in these ancient narratives.